The deafening silence after a blizzard-buried Pine Haven hid an extraordinary truth that fate had just orchestrated the most unlikely reunion imaginable. Max Sullivan, once a celebrated chef whose career was crushed by corporate takeover, now flipped burgers at a roadside diner where he'd just sheltered the very family who owned the restaurant empire that destroyed him. Neither Max nor the Harringtons, billionaire owners of 1,000 luxury restaurants worldwide, recognized each other as the howling winds forced them together for 3 desperate days. But when their young son's life hung by a thread during a severe asthma attack, Max's forgotten culinary genius and knowledge of mountain herbs became their salvation, igniting a reckoning about power, purpose, and the true meaning of hospitality that would forever change their intertwined destinies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Snowflakes drifted against the frost-edged windows of the Pine Haven diner as Max Sullivan wiped down the countertop for the 3rd time that hour. Outside, the December sky hung heavy with the promise of the season's first major storm. The weathered open sign swung in the strengthening wind, its red neon flickering against the gathering darkness of the late afternoon. Weather Service just upgraded it to a blizzard warning, Ruth Bennett called from the kitchen doorway, her lined face creased with concern. Says we could get 3 feet by morning. Max glanced up from the countertop, his movements deliberate, economical. At 48, his dark hair had begun to silver at the temples, matching the lingering shadows beneath his eyes. "Guess I'll be sleeping on the cot tonight," he replied, voice rough from years of disuse. Ruth shook her head. "No sense in both of us staying. I live 2 blocks away. You've got that cabin halfway up the mountain. Head home while the roads are still passable." Max's eyes drifted to the window, watching ice crystals form delicate patterns across the glass. A home that would be cold and empty, like it had been for the past 5 years. Here, at least, there was the warmth of the grill and the familiar rhythm of the diner's ancient refrigerator humming in the background. "I'll wait until closing," he said with quiet finality. "Make sure the pipes don't freeze." Ruth studied him with the knowing look she'd perfected over their 3 years together. She knew better than to push. Something had hollowed Max out long before he'd arrived in Pine Haven, and whatever it was, he guarded it like a wound that had never properly healed. "Suit yourself. I'm going to call Irene and tell her not to come in for the evening shift." As Ruth disappeared into the back office, the bell above the door jingled. Max looked up, surprised anyone would venture out with the storm approaching. Old Pete shambled in, stomping snow from his boots. "Cutting it close, Pete," Max commented, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Never missed my afternoon coffee in 30 years. Not about to let a little snow break my streak." The old man settled onto his usual stool, accepting the steaming mug with gnarled hands. "They're closing the pass. Sheriff's got roadblocks up already." Max nodded, turning toward the grill to prepare the old-timer's usual, 2 eggs over easy with rye toast. His hands moved with practiced precision, a mere shadow of the artistry they once possessed in kitchens where reservations were made months in advance. "Here it might be the worst since '87, Pete continued, warming his hands around the mug. "That one stranded half the town for a week. My Margaret was pregnant with our youngest then. Nearly had to deliver him myself." Max listened, without comment, allowing the old man's stories to flow around him like water around a stone. He'd become adept at this, being present while remaining separate, engaging just enough to satisfy social expectations without inviting deeper connections. The eggs sizzled on the grill, a sound that once would have been lost among the choreographed chaos of a high-end restaurant kitchen. Now, in the quiet of the near-empty diner, it filled the space between Pete's reminiscences. By 5 o'clock, the snow was falling in earnest, thick flakes swirling in the glow of the streetlights. Old Pete had reluctantly departed after extracting a promise from Max to save him some of tomorrow's beef stew. Ruth had finally taken Max's assurances that he would lock up properly and headed home, leaving him alone in the diner's comfortable solitude. Max moved through his closing routine, wiping down tables, refilling condiment bottles, and preparing ingredients for the next day's specials. The work was mindless enough to allow his thoughts to wander, as they often did, to another kitchen in another time, one with polished copper pots hanging from ceiling racks and the steady hum of expectation that accompanied a fully booked evening. The howl of the wind outside grew louder, occasionally rattling the windows with particular ferocity. Max had just begun mopping the floor when headlights cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the diner in a brief, bright flash before going dark. He paused, mop in hand, watching as a luxury SUV pulled into the lot, its tires spinning briefly, before gaining purchase on the already treacherous surface. For a moment, he considered pretending the diner was closed. The open sign had been turned off an hour ago, but something about the desperate way the vehicle had pulled in, as if seeking refuge rather than a meal, made him hesitate. 4 figures emerged from the vehicle, hunched against the driving snow. A tall man in what appeared to be an expensive overcoat, a slender woman, a teenage girl, and a small boy. The man half carried, half dragged the boy through the deepening snow toward the diner's entrance. Max set the mop aside and moved to unlock the door, pulling it open against the force of the wind. A blast of frigid air accompanied the family as they stumbled inside, bringing swirls of snow and the scent of cold and fear. "Thank God you're open," the man gasped, his face reddened from the cold. Up close, Max could see that his coat, while well-made, was soaked through. "Our son, he has asthma and our car slid off the road back there. We managed to get it out, but I think something's damaged underneath." The boy coughed, a wet, worrying sound that Max recognized all too well. The child's face was pale, his breathing labored as he clung to his mother. "The diner's closed," Max said, then seeing the flash of desperation in the woman's eyes, added, "But you can come in and warm up. I've got a phone you can use. The sheriff won't be sending anyone up here tonight," he continued, turning away to hide his discomfort at their gratitude. "Not with the pass closed. You folks are stuck until morning at least." "I'm William Harrington," the man said, extending a hand that Max reluctantly shook. "This is my wife Victoria, our daughter Emma, and our son Lucas." "Max Sullivan," he offered. Nothing more, already moving behind the counter. "I'll make some hot chocolate for the boy, might help warm him up." Victoria Harrington gently guided her son to the nearest booth, her movements betraying an understated elegance even in crisis. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying the refined tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. "We were heading to our vacation home in Aspen when the storm hit earlier than forecast." Max nodded without really listening, focusing instead on heating milk in a saucepan. He added a pinch of cinnamon and a touch of vanilla, small flourishes that had once been second nature in his professional life and now emerged only in unguarded moments. "The car making any unusual noises before it went off the road?" he asked, changing the subject away from their circumstances. William looked up from where he was helping Lucas out of his snow-covered coat. "Nothing I noticed. Just lost traction. On a curve. Sounds like you hit black ice. Road up to Snow Ridge gets treacherous this time of year." The teenage girl, Emma, stood slightly apart from her family, arms crossed defensively as she surveyed the modest diner with poorly concealed disdain. Her designer boots were caked with snow, and her expensive parka seemed out of place against the worn vinyl of the booth seats. "So we're stuck here?" she asked, voice pitched somewhere between accusation and dismay. "Emma," Victoria admonished quietly. Max set 5 mugs of hot chocolate on the counter. "There's no getting over the past tonight. Not with the way this storm's blowing in. Sheriff will have it barricaded by now anyway." But there must be a hotel or something, Emma persisted, ignoring the steaming mug placed before her. Nearest hotel's in Riverdale, 30 miles back the way you came. Max's tone remained matter of fact. Pine Haven's got the diner, a gas station, and about 400 people who know to stay home when a storm like this hits. Lucas coughed again, more violently this time, and Victoria's face tightened with concern. "Do you have his inhaler?" she asked William, who was already searching through his pockets. "It's in the suitcase," he realized aloud, his voice strained. "In the trunk." Without a word, Max took a ring of keys from beneath the counter and handed them to William. "Back door key, silver one. Get what you need. I'll make the boy something warm to eat." As William hurried out into the storm, Victoria turned to Max. "He shouldn't eat if he's having breathing trouble." Max was already moving toward the kitchen. "Not food, tea, chamomile with wild honey and a bit of thyme, old mountain remedy, helps open the airways." Victoria's surprise was evident. "You know about asthma treatments?" "I know about herbs," Max replied simply, disappearing into the kitchen. In the familiar sanctuary of the kitchen, Max allowed his hands to move automatically, selecting dried herbs from small jars he kept on a shelf above the prep station. These weren't part of the diner's regular inventory. Ruth tolerated his garden, witch nonsense, as she called it, with good-natured skepticism. The simple familiarity of preparation centered him, pushing away the discomfort of strangers invading the space he'd carved out for himself. He steeped the herbs carefully, adding a generous spoonful of the dark amber honey he collected from local hives. When he returned to the dining area, William had reappeared, snow-covered and clutching a small overnight bag and a medical device. Max recognized as a nebulizer. "Power," William said breathlessly. "It needs power." Max pointed to an outlet near the booth. "There. Diner's got a backup generator if the lines go down." As William set up the breathing treatment for Lucas, Victoria approached Max with the kind of careful politeness reserved for unpredictable strangers. "That tea you mentioned, here." He handed her the steaming mug. "Let it cool a bit first. Small sips after his treatment." Victoria studied the amber liquid. "What's in it?" "Nothing that'll hurt him. Chamomile, thyme, honey, bit of lemon balm." She hesitated, and Max felt a flicker of the old irritation he thought he'd buried years ago, the frustration of having his expertise questioned by those who equated wealth with wisdom. "I've been making it for asthmatics since before you were born," he added, more sharply than intended. "Your boy will be fine." Victoria's eyes widened slightly at his tone, but she nodded, accepting the mug and returning to her son. Max turned away, focusing on practical matters. "Diner's got a small apartment upstairs, 2 rooms. It's nothing fancy, but there's heat and beds. You folks can stay there tonight." "We couldn't impose," William began, but Max cut him off with a dismissive gesture. "Alternative is sleeping in your car in a blizzard with an asthmatic kid." He moved back toward the counter, adding over his shoulder, "I'll make up some soup. Boy should have something in his stomach with those medications." Emma, who had been silently tapping at her phone with increasing frustration, looked up. "There's no signal. Lines are probably down already," Max replied without sympathy. "Happens every big storm. But how are we supposed to let people know where we are?" Emma's voice rose with adolescent indignation. "Nobody's going anywhere tonight," Max said. "Not you, not them. Pine Haven's cut off until the plows come through, and that won't be until the storm passes." The finality in his voice silenced further protests. Max disappeared into the kitchen again, this time pulling ingredients for a simple chicken soup. Despite himself, his hands began to move with a fraction of their old confidence, dicing vegetables with precision, adjusting seasonings by instinct rather than measurement. It had been years since he'd cooked for anyone other than the diners. Regular customers. Years since he'd felt the quiet pride that came with creating something worthy of his training. Yet here, with strangers stranded by circumstances beyond anyone's control, some long-dormant part of him stirred reluctantly to life. In the dining area, Lucas's breathing treatment had begun to ease his symptoms. Victoria sat beside him, one arm around his small shoulders, while William paced near the windows, periodically checking his phone for a signal that wouldn't come. Emma had finally given up on her digital lifeline, and now sat with her chin propped on her hand, watching the snow build against the windows with the particular misery of a teenager separated from her virtual world. None of them could have known that the man grudgingly preparing their meal had once commanded kitchens where they might have dined, or that the company William Harrington had built had been the instrument of Max Sullivan's downfall. As the blizzard isolated Pine Haven from the outside world, it also suspended the normal order of things, creating a temporary universe where a ruined chef could offer shelter to the very people who had unknowingly ruined him. The storm was just beginning. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Max ladled the steaming soup into mismatched bowls, arranging them on a weathered serving tray. The aroma filling the kitchen was far more complex than typical diner fare. Hints of fresh thyme, roasted garlic, and a depth that came from properly prepared stock. It had been so long since he'd cooked with genuine intention that the familiar sensations felt almost like memories from someone else's life. He carried the tray to the booth where the Harringtons had settled, Lucas's breathing now more regular, though still concerning. The boy's face brightened at the sight of food. A good sign. "Chicken soup," Max said simply, setting the bowls down. "Nothing fancy." Victoria inhaled the fragrant steam rising from her bowl, a flicker of professional assessment crossing her features. "It smells wonderful," she said, her tone suggesting more than mere politeness. William looked up from his phone, which he'd been periodically checking despite the lack of service. "Thank you. We're imposing enough without you having to feed us too." Max shrugged off the gratitude. Soup was already on tomorrow's menu. It was a lie. He'd made this particular soup from scratch, using his own recipe rather than Ruth's standardized diner fare. He told himself it was just instinct, the old habits of proper technique that he'd never fully abandoned. Lucas tentatively spooned some broth, then looked up with wide eyes. "This tastes different than Mom's soup." Victoria smiled, exchanging a glance with her husband. "That's because Mr. Sullivan is a very good cook." Max tensed slightly, unexpected praise always leaving him uncomfortable. Emma, who had been sullenly staring out the window, finally turned her attention to the meal. "At least it's hot," she muttered. But the quick, surprised raise of her eyebrows after the first taste betrayed her appreciation. The wind howled with renewed fury outside, rattling the windows and causing the lights to flicker momentarily. Max glanced toward the ceiling, calculating. If the power goes, the generator kicks in automatically. Should last about 12 hours if we're careful. He nodded toward the kitchen. "I'll show you upstairs after you've eaten." William finished. A spoonful of soup, his expression thoughtful. "You seem well prepared for emergencies." "Mountain winters teach preparation," Max replied simply. "Or they teach hard lessons." Victoria studied him over the rim of her bowl. "Have you lived in Pine Haven long?" "Long enough." His clipped response did nothing to discourage Victoria, who possessed the particular social skills of someone accustomed to navigating different worlds. "The herbs you recommended for Lucas, did you learn about those locally?" Max hesitated, a fragment of his past briefly visible. "My grandmother grew herbs, taught me their uses." He paused, then added reluctantly, "Most of what I know about Cooking started in her kitchen too. This soup certainly didn't come from a diner cookbook, Victoria observed. The depth of flavor, the balance. Max gave her a sharp look, sensing something more significant than casual appreciation in her assessment. "Just soup," he said dismissively, rising to refill their water glasses. The lights flickered again, longer this time, before stabilizing. Lucas coughed softly, but without the alarming rattle from earlier. That tea seems to have helped, William noted, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. Max nodded. "Make him another cup before bed. There's more in the kitchen." "So, you just live in this diner?" Emma asked suddenly, her teenage bluntness cutting through the polite conversation. "Emma," Victoria admonished quietly. "What?" "It's a simple question." Max surprised himself by answering. "I've got a cabin about 20 minutes from here. Didn't make sense to risk the drive tonight, alone." The question slipped from Emma, with the particular lack of filter common to her age. A hardness settled over Max's features. "Yes." The silence that followed carried the weight of boundaries crossed. William cleared his throat. "Let's get our things. From the car, before the snow gets any deeper." Max watched as William bundled up to retrieve their luggage, Emma trailing reluctantly behind her father. Victoria remained with Lucas, whose color had improved with the warm food and medicine. "The soup really is exceptional," Victoria said when they were alone. "It reminds me of a restaurant I visited years ago in Chicago. The chef there had a similar way with broths, depth without heaviness." Max busied himself clearing empty bowls, his movements suddenly mechanical. "Like I said, nothing fancy. And used to cook professionally," Victoria continued, either missing or ignoring his discomfort, "before I married William and we started the business." Max stilled for a fraction of a second, an almost imperceptible hesitation that would have been invisible to anyone not trained to notice the rhythms of a kitchen. "That's so," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "It was a small French bistro in Chicago, nothing like what we have now, but it taught me to recognize true talent." She looked at him directly, "Which you clearly have." Before Max could respond, the door burst open with a gust of snow-laden wind as William and Emma returned, arms laden with suitcases and bags. "It's getting impossible out there," William announced, stamping snow from his boots. "Visibility's down to nothing." Max seized the distraction, moving toward the stairs at the back of the diner. "I'll show you where you'll stay." The apartment above the diner was sparse, but clean, a testament to Ruth's practical nature rather than any homemaking inclination on Max's part. A small living area connected to 2 bedrooms, with a modest bathroom between them. The furniture was mismatched but serviceable, clearly collected over years rather than purchased as a set. "It's not much," Max said, switching on a lamp that cast a warm glow over the faded armchair and small sofa. "But it's warm." William surveyed the space with the assessment of someone who owned properties across multiple continents, but was wise enough to recognize sanctuary when it was offered. "It's perfect. We're grateful." Emma made a beeline for the larger bedroom, dropping her designer bag on the patchwork quilt. Lucas followed his sister, his earlier fatigue seemingly forgotten as he explored the unfamiliar space. Victoria lingered in the living area, her gaze catching on a framed photograph partially hidden on a bookshelf. It showed a younger Max in a white chef's coat, standing proud beside an older woman in a restaurant kitchen. "Is this your grandmother?" she asked, gesturing toward the photo. Max crossed the room in 2 strides, taking the frame and placing it face down on the shelf. "Extra blankets in the closet," he said, ignoring her question entirely. "Bathroom's got limited hot water, so keep showers short. I'll be downstairs if you need anything." He retreated before Victoria could press further, the stairs creaking. Beneath his hurried descent, in the diner's kitchen, Max braced his hands against the countertop, drawing a deep breath. The woman's innocent questions had excavated memories he'd spent years burying. The wind's howl penetrated even the diner's sturdy walls, a fitting accompaniment to the storm brewing inside him. 5 years of carefully constructed isolation threatened. By strangers who asked too many questions and noticed too much. Methodically, Max began preparing for the night ahead. He checked the generator's fuel level, brought extra firewood inside from the storage shed, and inventoried the pantry. Physical tasks to occupy his hands while his mind circled warily around the family upstairs. There was something familiar about Victoria Harrington, something that nagged at the edges of his memory. Perhaps she had dined at his restaurant once. The thought brought a bitter taste to his mouth. His restaurant. Once his pride, now a painful footnote in his personal history. The lights flickered again, then went out completely. After 10 seconds of absolute darkness, the generator hummed to life, restoring power to essential circuits only. The kitchen remained dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Footsteps on the stairs announced William's arrival. He appeared in the doorway, looking more humanly disheveled than he had earlier, his expensive sweater exchanged for a simpler thermal shirt. "Power's out, I assume?" Max nodded. "Generators running. Should last through the night if the main power doesn't come back." William hesitated, then stepped fully into the kitchen. "Listen, I want to properly thank you. Lucas's attacks can be serious, and your quick thinking with that tea, it's nothing." Max cut him off. "Anyone would have done the same. We both." "No, that's not true." William's voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to assessing people accurately. "Most would have turned us away after closing, especially in a storm." Max busied himself organizing supplies for morning. "Your boy needed help." "Yes, he did." William studied Max with newfound interest. "Victoria tells me you're a professional. Chef. Or were." Max's hands stilled momentarily. "Long time ago." "Where did you train?" The direct question hung in the air, unexpected and unwelcome. Max considered brushing it off, but found himself answering truthfully. "Started in my grandmother's kitchen. Then Johnson & Wales, worked my way up in Chicago, New York. Had my own place eventually." William leaned against the doorframe. "What was it called? Your restaurant?" "Doesn't matter now." "It matters to you," William observed quietly. "Otherwise, you wouldn't look like I'd struck you whenever it comes up." Max turned, a flash of the commanding presence he'd once possessed in professional kitchens momentarily visible. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Harrington?" William held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Just making conversation. Trying to know the man who's sheltering my family. Now you know. I cook diner food in a small town because it's simple and people leave me be. That's all there is to it." Even as the words left his mouth, Max knew they rang hollow. William Harrington, whatever else he might be, was clearly a man accustomed to reading people, but to Max's surprise, he simply nodded. "Fair enough. We'll be gone as soon as the road's clear." He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, that soup wasn't diner food. That was the work of someone who still cares about his craft, whether he admits it or not. Left alone again, Max felt the walls he'd built around himself vibrating like the windows under the storm's assault. He'd spent 5 years cultivating invisibility, becoming the kind of man people looked past rather than at. These strangers threatened that careful construction. Morning would come. The plows would eventually clear the pass. The Harringtons would return to their privileged lives, and Max would return to his deliberate obscurity. He just needed to make it through the night. A small sound at the kitchen entrance drew his attention. Lucas stood there in flannel pajamas, his hair tousled from attempted sleep. "I can't sleep," the boy said simply. "The wind is too loud, and I left my book in the car." Max studied the child, so clearly his mother's son, in the thoughtful set of his eyes. You're breathing okay? Lucas nodded. The tea helped. Mom made me more before bed. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. The adult uncertain how to engage with the child who had appeared seeking comfort. Max wasn't sure he could provide. Hungry? He finally asked, defaulting to the one language he still spoke fluently. Lucas shook his head, then reconsidered. Maybe a little. Max moved to the refrigerator, removing ingredients with the focus of someone grateful for a task. Hot chocolate. Real kind, not the powdered stuff. The boy's face brightened, and he climbed onto a stool at the prep counter. Yes, please. As Max began melting chocolate and warming milk, Lucas watched with undisguised fascination. You don't make it like Mom does, he observed. Everyone's got their own way, Max replied, whisking gently. This is how my grandmother taught me. The herb lady? Max glanced at the boy, surprised at his attentiveness. Yeah, the herb lady. Was she nice? The simple question somehow bypassed Max's usual defenses. The best person I ever knew, he answered. Honestly, taught me everything important, like how to make soup that makes people feel better. Max's hands stilled for a moment. Yeah, like that. He poured the rich chocolate into a mug, adding a small dollop of whipped cream he'd quickly prepared. Lucas accepted it with the solemn gratitude of a child who understood he was receiving something special. This is the best hot chocolate ever, he declared after the first careful sip. Despite himself, Max felt a ghost of pleasure at the simple praise. Secret ingredient, he said, tapping the side of his nose conspiratorially. What is it? Lucas asked, wide-eyed. Wouldn't be a secret. If I told you. The boy considered this logic, then nodded seriously. I won't tell anyone. Max found himself at a crossroads. Maintain the distance he'd cultivated for years, or share a small, inconsequential part of himself with a child who sought connection. Cinnamon and a pinch of cayenne, he said finally. Warms you from the inside out. Lucas's smile revealed a gap where a tooth had recently departed. I knew it tasted special. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence as Lucas finished his hot chocolate and the storm raged outside. The simplicity of the moment, a warm drink on a cold night, shared without expectation, stirred something long dormant in Max. A dad gets busy a lot, Lucas said suddenly, breaking the silence. He doesn't make things in the kitchen like you do. Max felt a pang of recognition, the familiar refrain of a child whose parents' ambition left little room for smaller moments. Your dad takes care of you in other ways, he replied, surprising himself with the defense of a man he barely knew. Lucas traced the rim of his empty mug with one finger. He tries, but he and Mom are always working. Emma says it's because they have thousands of restaurants to worry about. Max froze, the casual comment striking like a physical blow. Thousands? Not thousands, Lucas corrected himself. 1,000 exactly. Dad always says even 1,000. Mom says it's too many, but Dad says... He yawned widely, the combination of medication, warm drink, and late hour finally catching up with him. Says what? Max prompted, his throat suddenly dry. Says they've got a legacy to build. Lucas slid off the stool, rubbing his eyes. I should go back upstairs. Mum will worry. Max stood motionless as the boy padded back toward the stairs, his innocent revelation resonating like a struck bell. 1,000 restaurants, a legacy. The pieces began to arrange themselves in Max's mind, forming a picture he'd been too isolated to see earlier. Harrington, not just any wealthy family, but the Harringtons of Harrington Restaurant Group, the conglomerate that had systematically acquired independent restaurants across the country. The company whose ruthless expansion had included the leveraged buyout of a critically acclaimed Chicago restaurant called Sullivan's 5 years ago. His restaurant. Max steadied himself against the counter, the irony almost too perfect to be believed. Of all the diners, in all the small towns, in all the mountain passes, William Harrington, the man whose company had destroyed everything Max had built, had walked into his. The blizzard that had forced them together now seemed almost orchestrated by some cosmic force, with a particularly dark sense of humor. Max looked toward the ceiling, imagining the family sleeping peacefully above, unaware that they were sheltering under the roof of a man their empire had crushed. What would happen when morning came, if they realized? What would happen if they didn't? Outside, the wind screamed through the pine trees surrounding the small town, the snow piling higher against the diner's doors. Nature itself seemed determined to keep them confined together, forcing a reckoning none of them had sought. Max moved to the window, watching his reflection ghosted against the darkness beyond. 5 years of carefully maintained anonymity shattered by a boy's bedtime conversation. 5 years of buried resentment, now unearthed by coincidence. In the dimly lit kitchen of a roadside diner, as a blizzard isolated them from the outside world, Max Sullivan faced the choice between the bitter comfort of his long-held grudge and the unsettling possibility of something he'd avoided far more actively than any snowstorm, the prospect of genuine human connection. Morning would come eventually, but the night stretched long before them all. Dawn broke reluctantly over Pine Haven, the pale winter light struggling to penetrate the still-falling snow. The blizzard had weakened overnight, but hadn't surrendered entirely, leaving the small town buried under nearly 3 feet of white. The diner sat like an island in a frozen sea, its windows frosted with elaborate crystal patterns. Max hadn't slept. After Lucas's inadvertent revelation, rest had been impossible. He'd spent the night alternating between checking the generator, stoking the small wood stove in the corner of the diner, and pacing the kitchen as fragments of his past circled like hungry wolves. The sudden knowledge of who exactly was sleeping upstairs had reopened wounds he'd thought scarred over. Sullivan's had been more than just a restaurant to him. It had been the culmination of everything he'd worked for since leaving his grandmother's kitchen at 17. Critics had praised his innovative approach to traditional American cuisine. Reservations had been booked months in advance. For 3 glorious years, he'd created food that made people remember why eating was about more than mere sustenance. Then, Harrington Restaurant Group had arrived with their polished lawyers and promises of partnership. Within 6 months, the partnership had become a controlling interest. 3 months after that, Sullivan's was closed, its concept deemed unmarketable to a wider audience. Its recipes and techniques, Max's personal creations, were passed out among Harrington's more commercial ventures, stripped of their soul and standardized for mass consumption. The coffee maker gurgled, bringing Max back to the present. He moved through the familiar routine of morning preparations, taking comfort in the mundane tasks. The power remained out, but the generator provided enough electricity for essential equipment. He'd need to be selective about what he prepared for breakfast, something that required minimal power but would sustain them through what promised to be another day of confinement. Footsteps on the stairs announced the first of his unwitting adversaries. Victoria Harrington appeared, wrapped in a cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that somehow managed to look elegant rather than haphazard. "Good morning," she said, her voice hushed as though respecting the strange intimacy of the situation. "You're up early?" "Never went down," Max replied, pushing a mug of coffee across the counter without meeting her eyes. She accepted it gratefully, inhaling the steam. "You don't seem like a man who struggles with insomnia." "Storm keeps me alert." The half-truth came easily. "I need to monitor the generator, make sure pipes don't freeze." Victoria studied him over the rim of her mug, her gaze more perceptive than he would have liked. "Of course." Max turned away, busying himself with breakfast preparations. The simple act of cracking eggs into a bowl become a shield against conversation, against recognition. "I could help," Victoria offered, setting her coffee down. "I meant what I said last night about cooking professionally." The offer hung between them, innocent, yet loaded with implications Victoria couldn't possibly understand. Max nearly refused outright. The thought of working alongside a Harrington in any kitchen, even Ruth's humble diner, almost physically painful. "Fine," he said instead, surprising himself. "Potatoes need dicing, small and even." Victoria rolled up her sleeves without hesitation, moving to the sink to wash her hands with the practiced motions of someone who'd spent significant time in professional kitchens. Max handed her a knife, not the best in the kitchen but far from the worst, and watched surreptitiously as she began to work. Her technique was undeniable, her movements economical and precise. "Classically trained?" he asked despite himself. "L'Endrekud. Cordon bleu, briefly," she replied, her focus on the task at hand. "Before I met William. Long way from French cuisine to diner breakfast?" Victoria smiled, the expression softening the elegant angles of her face. "Not really. Good technique is universal. My grandmother used to say that you can judge a cook by how they prepare the simplest dishes." The unexpected echo of his own grandmother's philosophy caught Max off guard. He grunted non-committally and returned to whisking eggs, adding a pinch of dried herbs almost unconsciously. They worked in surprising harmony, moving around each other in the small kitchen with the intuitive choreography of experienced cooks. Despite his resentment, Max found himself appreciating her competence, the way she anticipated needs without being told. "Smells wonderful in here," William announced as he descended the stairs with Lucas. The boy looked better this morning, his breathing easier and color normal. "Lucas was worried you might have left." Max glanced at the child, who ducked his head shyly. "Storm's still going. Nobody's leaving today." "The snow is higher than our car," Lucas exclaimed, pressing his face against the window. "Dad, can we go outside later?" "We'll see, buddy." William ruffled his son's hair, the gesture containing a warmth that seemed at odds with Max's mental image of the corporate raider who'd dismantled his life's work. "Let's not get your mom worried about your breathing again." Emma appeared last, her teenage ability to sleep through disaster apparently intact despite the circumstances. She slouched at the counter, immediately reaching for the coffee pot. "Emma," Victoria cautioned, "you know the rule about coffee." The girl sighed dramatically. "Mom, I'm literally trapped in a diner in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard. I think caffeine is the least of our concerns." Max surprised himself by pouring a half cup and sliding it toward Emma, adding a generous portion of milk without being asked. "Half strength," he said with a shrug when Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Special circumstances." Emma's expression flickered with something like gratitude before she carefully rearranged her features into studied adolescent indifference. "Thanks." Max and Victoria served breakfast, a hearty frittata with potatoes and bacon, biscuits baked, in the still functioning oven, and preserves Max had put up himself from last summer's berries. Despite the simplicity of the meal, the Harringtons fell upon it with appreciative murmurs. "This is incredible," William said after his first bite. "Better than what we get at the lodge in Aspen." The compliment, meant kindly, twisted in Max like a knife. Of course it was better. He'd been creating food that put most resort lodges to shame long before Harrington's company had destroyed his restaurant. "Just eggs," he muttered, turning away to check the generator. Outside, the wind had died down, but the snow continued falling. Steadily, the diner's front entrance was nearly blocked by a drift that reached halfway up the door. Through the windows, Pine Haven was barely recognizable, the familiar buildings transformed into vague white humps, the streets completely obscured. "Your phone working yet?" Max asked William, gesturing toward the device that seemed permanently attached to the man's hand. William shook his head. "Nothing. Towers must be down. Landlines dead too. Max wiped his hands on a dish towel. Radio says the county's declared a state of emergency. No plows until the snowfall stops completely. So we're stuck here another day? Emma's voice rose. With dismay. At least, Max confirmed, taking grim satisfaction in her displeasure. Maybe longer. Victoria placed a calming hand on her daughter's shoulder. We're fortunate to have shelter, Emma. Many people might be in true danger during a storm like this. The family's reaction to their continued confinement revealed their individual characters more clearly in daylight. William accepted the news. With the pragmatism of a man accustomed to adjusting business strategies when circumstances changed, Victoria's calm suggested a resilience beyond her polished exterior. Emma's frustration was pure teenage self-absorption, while Lucas seemed positively delighted at the extended adventure. What do people do here when they're snowed in? Lucas asked, scraping the last bits of egg from his plate. Max had spent his snow days in solitary silence at his cabin, but that answer wouldn't satisfy a curious 8-year-old. Board games in the storage closet, cards, books in the apartment upstairs. I finished my book last night, Lucas said. Do you have any about cooking? The innocent question landed squarely on the dividing line between Max's past and present. His personal collection of rare cookbooks and chef memoirs had been sold years ago to fund his escape from Chicago. Few basic ones upstairs, he answered shortly. Victoria studied her son with evident curiosity. Since when are you interested in cookbooks? Lucas glanced at Max before answering. Mr. Sullivan makes food that tastes like a story. I want to learn how. The simple observation, delivered with a child's unfiltered honesty, silenced the kitchen. William looked at his son with surprise, Victoria with a dawning understanding, and Emma with reluctant interest. Max felt exposed, as though the boy had somehow seen through the carefully constructed facade of the simple diner cook to the chef, who had once poured narrative and emotion into every plate he'd sent from his kitchen. Cooking's just science and practice, he said gruffly, gathering. Empty plates. Nothing magical about it. That's not true, Victoria countered quietly. What you do with food, what you've always done, I suspect, is art. Lucas recognizes that, even if he doesn't have the vocabulary for it yet. Max's head snapped up, her words striking uncomfortably close to a review his restaurant had received. In its first year, the critic had written that Sullivan transforms familiar ingredients into emotional experiences, creating dishes that tell stories on the palate. He searched Victoria's face for any sign that she had made the connection between the diner cook who had sheltered her family and the once celebrated chef whose restaurant her husband's company had acquired and shuttered. Her expression revealed nothing beyond sincere appreciation. Got work to do, Max muttered, retreating to the relative safety of chores. The day stretched before them, confined together in the diner's limited space with dwindling distractions. William attempted to create a hotspot with his phone, growing increasingly frustrated as each attempt failed. Victoria found a worn paperback in the apartment and settled into a booth, while Emma alternated between catnapping and sighing dramatically at the ceiling. Lucas, however, seemed determined to shadow Max, peppering him with questions as he checked the generator, insulated exposed pipes, and inventoried their remaining supplies. Is it hard to be a chef? The boy asked, trailing Max to the storage room. Was, Max corrected without thinking. Was a chef. Now I cook at a diner. But you were a real chef before, with a tall hat and everything. Despite himself, Max felt his lips twitch. The hat's called a toque. And yeah, I had one. Long time ago. Did you cook in a fancy restaurant? Max paused, cans of tomatoes in hand, the weight of his past pressing against his carefully constructed present. I did. What happened to it? The direct question, delivered without guile, demanded a response that Max wasn't prepared to give. Especially not with the boy's father sitting mere yards away, oblivious to the connection between them. "It closed," Max said finally. "Businesses close sometimes." "That's what happened to my dad's first restaurant," Lucas continued, accepting a can to carry back to the kitchen. "The one my grandpa started. Dad says it was too small to survive, but Mum says it had the most heart." Max nearly dropped the supplies he was carrying. "Your family started with one restaurant?" Lucas nodded eagerly. "Grandpa Edward's Diner in Chicago. Dad has a picture of it in his office. He says it reminds him why they work so hard. But Mom says he's forgotten what it really means." Each casual revelation from the boy felt like another piece of a puzzle Max hadn't known he was solving. The Harrington Empire, which he'd imagined as an impersonal corporate machine, had begun as a single diner, not unlike the one currently sheltering them. "Your mom and dad disagree about the business?" Max found himself asking, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Lucas shrugged. "Mom wants Dad to stop buying so many restaurants. She says they're losing what made them special in the beginning." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "They think I don't hear them arguing, but I do." Before Max could process this information, a sharp cry from the dining area interrupted them. They rushed back to find Emma standing at the window pointing outside. "There's someone out there," she exclaimed, "walking in the snow." Max pushed past her to peer through the frosted glass. Sure enough, a figure was struggling through the deep snow about 50 yards from the diner, bent against the still falling precipitation. The person stumbled, nearly disappearing into a drift before regaining their footing. Without hesitation, Max grabbed his heavy coat from the hook by the door. "Stay inside," he ordered, already pulling on gloves and a hat. "You can't go out in that," William protested. "Nobody survives long in this cold," Max replied grimly. "Nearest house is a quarter-mile away. They'll never make it." He forced the door open against the weight of snow, a blast of frigid air rushing into the warm diner. Before anyone could argue further, Max plunged into the storm, the snow immediately rising past his knees. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing his breath despite the layers he wore. Max pushed forward, establishing a path toward the struggling figure, who had fallen again and appeared to be having trouble rising. As he drew closer, Max recognized the red jacket of Natalie Brooks, the documentary filmmaker who'd been staying at the Pinehaven Inn for the past month, working on some project about rural mountain communities. What she was doing out in a blizzard he couldn't imagine, but the question could wait until they were both safely inside. "Brooks," he shouted, against the wind, "stay where you are, I'm coming to you." Natalie turned toward his voice, her face nearly unrecognizable beneath a layer of ice crystals formed from her own breath. Relief washed over her features as she saw him approaching. "Max," she gasped when he reached her. "Thank God. The inn's furnace died, no heat. I saw the diner's lights." "Save it," Max interrupted, wrapping an arm around her. "Let's get inside first." The return journey felt twice as long, the path he'd created already filling with fresh snow. By the time they reached the diner's entrance, William had cleared enough snow away for them to push through the door into blessed warmth. Natalie collapsed into the nearest booth, shivering violently. Victoria immediately went to her, helping remove her frozen outer layers, while Emma, surprisingly practical in an actual emergency, fetched blankets from upstairs. How far did I walk?" Natalie managed between chattering teeth. "Half-mile at least," Max replied, his own extremities burning as circulation returned. "In zero visibility. You're lucky you found the diner at all." Lucky you saw me." William appeared with a mug of hot tea. "Drink this, slowly." Natalie accepted gratefully, her hands shaking so badly that William had to help her hold the mug. As the warmth gradually returned to her body, the blue tinge receding from her lips, she looked around at the assembled group. "Power's out all," "Over town," she explained. "I tried to stick it out at the inn, but the temperature kept dropping. When I saw lights from my window, I thought I could make it here." She shuddered, didn't realize how deep the snow had gotten. "You have hypothermia," Max said bluntly. "Not severe, but heading that way. Need to get your core temperature up slowly." He turned to Victoria. "There's more broth from last night. Heat it up, not too hot." Victoria nodded, moving to the kitchen with purpose. Max noticed that she navigated the unfamiliar space with increasing confidence, finding what she needed without having to ask where things were kept. "I don't mean to impose," Natalie said weakly, "especially since you already have guests." "Not exactly guests," William replied, with a wry smile. "More like refugees. I'm William Harrington. My wife Victoria, daughter Emma and son Lucas. We were stranded here yesterday when the storm hit." Recognition dawned in Natalie's eyes, the documentarian in her clearly filing away information despite her physical distress. "Harrington? As in Harrington Restaurant Group?" William nodded, looking somewhat uncomfortable at being recognized. "That's right." "What remarkable luck," Natalie mused, her professional interest momentarily overriding her discomfort. "I've been wanting to interview someone from your organization for my documentary on how small towns are affected by corporate acquisitions. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees that had nothing to do with the storm outside." Max stiffened, casting a sharp glance at Natalie. The filmmaker had no way of knowing the landmine she'd just stumbled across. William's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid I don't discuss business matters without our PR team present." "Of course I understand," Natalie backpedaled, sensing the sudden tension. "I'm just surprised to find you here of all places. Pine Haven isn't exactly on the corporate acquisition radar." Victoria returned with broth for Natalie, the simple act breaking the awkward moment. As she helped the filmmaker wrap her hands around the warm bowl, she asked with genuine curiosity, "What brings you to Pine Haven, Ms. Brooks?" "Please, call me Natalie." She sipped the broth gratefully. "I'm working on a documentary about resilience in rural communities. How places like Pine Haven maintain their identity in an increasingly homogenized America." Max moved away from the conversation, retreating to the kitchen under the pretense of inventory. The irony of the situation threatened to overwhelm him. A documentary filmmaker interested in corporate takeovers, the CEO of Harrington Restaurant Group, and the chef whose restaurant they'd destroyed, all trapped together in a blizzard. It felt like the setup for a particularly heavy-handed play. Through the pass-through window, he could see William deflecting Natalie's professional interest with practiced ease, steering the conversation towards safer topics. Victoria attended to Lucas, who appeared fascinated by their new guest. Emma had retreated into her phone again, though the device remained as useless as it had been yesterday. A new complication in an already complicated situation. Max focused on slicing bacon for what would likely be their dinner, the familiar, repetitive motions soothing his tangled thoughts. The storm had now delivered 5 people to his doorstep, each representing some aspect of the life he'd left behind or the one he'd built since. Outside, the snow continued to fall, insulating them from the wider world and forcing connections Max had spent years avoiding. The question that had kept him awake all night returned with renewed urgency. When the storm cleared and the truth was fully revealed, what would remain? Would they all simply return to their separate lives, or had something fundamental shifted? During these hours of enforced intimacy, Max had no answer, only the certainty that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one gathering within. Evening settled over the snowbound diner, the early winter darkness amplifying the sense of isolation. The generator hummed steadily, providing just enough power to keep essential systems running. Max had distributed flashlights and battery-powered lanterns throughout the space, creating pools of warm light that made the diner feel smaller, more intimate than its usual fluorescent brightness allowed. Dinner preparations had become a group effort out of necessity. With limited power and dwindling supplies, Max had been forced to accept help, assigning tasks based on ability rather than preference. Victoria had proven herself invaluable, her formal training evident in the efficient way she transformed simple ingredients into components for their meal. Even Emma had been recruited to set tables and prepare a rudimentary salad from the diner's remaining fresh vegetables. "The storm's finally letting up," William announced, returning from his hourly check of conditions outside. "Still snowing, but I can actually see across the street now." "Any sign of plows?" Natalie asked. The filmmaker had recovered from her brush with hypothermia, but remained wrapped in a blanket, nursing her third cup of tea. William shook his head. "Nothing yet. But if it stops overnight, they might get to us by tomorrow afternoon." The news brought mixed reactions. Emma's face brightened with hope, while Lucas looked almost disappointed at the prospect of their adventure ending. Max felt an unexpected twist of emotion he couldn't immediately identify. Not quite relief, not quite regret, but something hovering uncomfortably between. "Dinner's ready," Victoria called, carrying a large pot from the kitchen. The aroma that preceded her was far more complex than typical diner fare. Max had allowed himself to cook with intention again, building layers of flavor from the limited pantry ingredients. They gathered around two tables pushed together, the unlikely grouping of stranded travelers sharing what felt suspiciously like a family meal. Natalie had fully integrated herself into the dynamic, her natural curiosity and genuine warmth making her an easy addition to their temporary community. "This is incredible," she said, after her first bite of the bean and vegetable stew Max had created. "Seriously, Max, you're wasted on breakfast specials and meatloaf." Max tensed, focusing on his bowl rather than acknowledging the compliment. "Food's food. Doesn't matter how fancy the plate is." "I disagree," Victoria said, surprising him with a direct challenge. "What you've done here, transforming pantry staples into something with this kind of depth, that's not just cooking, that's craft." William studied Max with renewed interest. "My wife doesn't give culinary praise lightly, Mr. Sullivan. Before we built our company, she was considered one of Chicago's promising young chefs." "Long time ago," Victoria said, unconsciously echoing Max's earlier phrase about his own career. "Different life." "You worked in Chicago?" Natalie asked Max, her documentary instincts clearly engaged. "What a coincidence. That's where Harrington Restaurant Group is headquartered, right?" The room fell silent, the only sound the howling of the wind outside and the clink of spoons against bowls. Max kept his eyes on his food, feeling every muscle in his body tighten with the effort of maintaining his composure. "I believe Mr. Sullivan has made it clear he doesn't like discussing his past," William said carefully. "We should respect that." The diplomatic response, so different from the cutthroat businessman Max had imagined, caught him off guard. He glanced up to find William watching him, with an expression that wasn't quite suspicion, but definitely contained a new awareness. Lucas broke the tense moment with 8-year-old timing. "Can we play a game after dinner? I found Monopoly upstairs." "Not Monopoly," Emma groaned. "That game takes forever and Dad always wins. It is literally the perfect game for our situation," Natalie pointed out with a smile. "We're not going anywhere, and Mr. Harrington is actually a business mogul. It's almost 2 on the nose." The unexpected joke released some of the building tension. Even Max found himself suppressing a reluctant smile. "I used to crush my competitors," At Monopoly when I was a kid, William admitted. It's probably why I went to business school. Victoria reached for her water glass. And here I thought it was because your father expected you to expand the family business. Something in her tone suggested this was well-traveled ground between them, a disagreement wrapped in years of history. William's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of defensiveness quickly masked. The expectation and the aptitude happened. "To a line," he replied mildly, though Max detected an undercurrent of something harder. "Besides, can you imagine Edward Harrington's son choosing any other path?" "You never know," Victoria countered. "You might have been a great chef yourself. You certainly have the palate for it." William laughed, but the sound held little humor. "One chef in the family was enough. I preferred building restaurants to cooking in them." Max pushed his empty bowl away, the casual reference to building restaurants landing like a blow. His restaurant hadn't been built by William Harrington. It had been dismantled by him piece by piece, until nothing remained but a hollow corporate shell. "So what would it take?" Natalie asked William, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents. "For Pine Haven to appear on Harrington Restaurant Group's radar?" William considered the question with surprising seriousness. "We look for unique concepts with growth potential, distinctive local cuisine that could translate to broader markets or strategic locations in developing areas." He glanced around the modest diner. "No offense to Ruth's establishment, but Pine Haven probably isn't a market we'd target." "Because it's too small?" Max found himself asking, the question emerging with an edge he couldn't quite disguise. "Because what makes a place like this special is precisely what would be lost in expansion," William replied, his answer surprising Max. "The personal connection, the integration with the community. Some restaurants should remain singular experiences." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly, a look passing between her and her husband that suggested his response was unexpected to her as well. "That's not the corporate philosophy I would have expected," Natalie observed, her filmmaker's instinct. For narrative clearly engaged, William's expression turned reflective. "Let's just say my thinking has evolved recently." He glanced at Victoria. "Sometimes it takes stepping away from the quarterly reports to remember why we started in the first place." The conversation had veered dangerously close to territory Max had avoided for 5 years. He stood abruptly, gathering empty bowls. "Getting late. Generator fuel needs to be conserved, should probably turn in soon." "I'll help with dishes," Victoria offered, rising to follow him to the kitchen. Max wanted to refuse, to maintain the distance that kept his emotions safely buried, but practicality won out. With limited power and water, an extra pair of hands made sense. He nodded curtly and continued to the kitchen, Victoria following with the remaining dishes. They worked in silence for several minutes, the rhythm established during breakfast returning naturally. Max washed while Victoria dried, their movements synchronized despite having never worked together before these strange, stranded days. "You recognized me earlier," Victoria said finally, her voice pitched low enough that those in the dining area couldn't hear. "When William mentioned Chicago, you had a restaurant there, didn't you?" Max's hands stilled in the soapy water. The direct question demanded either a lie or an admission he wasn't sure he was ready to make. "Long time ago," he said again, the phrase becoming a shield against unwanted conversation. Victoria placed a dried plate on the stack with deliberate care. "I ate at a restaurant in Chicago once, about 6 years ago. Sullivan's. The chef there did things with familiar ingredients. That changed how I thought about food. His bean soup in particular reminded me of what we ate tonight." The blood rushed in Max's ears, the kitchen suddenly too warm, too small. She knew, or at least she suspected. "Common name," he managed. "Common name, uncommon talent." Victoria turned to face him directly. "It was you, wasn't it? You're Maxwell, Sullivan of Sullivan's in Chicago." The sound of his full name, unused for 5 years, struck like a physical blow. Max gripped the edge of the sink, water dripping from his hands onto the worn linoleum floor. "Doesn't matter who I was," he said. "Finally, that life's gone." Victoria's expression softened with understanding and something that looked dangerously like pity. "Because of our company." It wasn't a question. Max turned away, unable to bear the compassion in her eyes. 5 years of carefully contained anger threatened to spill over, and he struggled to force it back into the compartment where he'd kept it locked away. "Your husband's company," he corrected, the words emerging with more bitterness than he'd intended. A footnote in the Harrington. Expansion. One more independent restaurant swallowed up and shut down. "I'm sorry," Victoria said quietly. "I didn't know. I was no longer involved in acquisitions by then." Max laughed, a sharp sound devoid of humor. "Would it have mattered if you were? Corporate raiders don't typically concern themselves with the lives they dismantle." "That's not fair," Victoria countered, her own edge emerging. "William isn't some heartless corporate raider. He's built something extraordinary from his father's single diner by destroying what others built." Max shot back, keeping his voice low despite his rising anger. "Sullivan's wasn't failing. It was profitable. It was acclaimed. Your husband's company gutted it because they could, then cherry-picked the pieces. They wanted and discarded the rest." Victoria fell silent, absorbing his words. In the dining area, they could hear William explaining the rules of Monopoly to Lucas while Emma and Natalie arranged the board. The domestic scene created a jarring counterpoint to the tension in the kitchen. "I can't defend what happened to your restaurant," Victoria finally said. "But I can tell you that William was personally involved in very few acquisitions during that period. The company was expanding rapidly, and most decisions were made by regional directors. Convenient absolution for the man at the top," Max observed coldly. Victoria's eyes flashed with unexpected fire. "You think you're the only one who's lost something? William inherited a mission from his father to create something meaningful, something that preserved the best of American culinary traditions. Somewhere along the way, with investors and board members and quarterly growth targets, that mission got buried." She placed the dish towel down with careful control. "What happened to your restaurant was wrong, but blaming William personally for every misstep in a 1,000-restaurant organization isn't just unfair, it ignores the complexity of what building something that large actually entails." Before Max could respond, Lucas appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression bright with excitement. "Mom, Dad says to ask if we can have dessert while we play the game." Victoria's demeanor transformed instantly, maternal warmth replacing passionate defense. "If Mr. Sullivan has something suitable for an 8-year-old this late." Both turned to Max, the weight of their interrupted conversation hanging between them. He considered refusing, retreating into the cold shell he'd maintained for years. But Lucas's expectant face made that impossible. "Got canned peaches and some pound cake," he said gruffly. "Could do a shortcake of sorts." Lucas beamed. "With whipped cream, like on the hot chocolate?" Despite everything, Max felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "If we're careful with the power, I can whip some cream." "Yes!" Lucas pumped his fist in victory before racing back to the dining area to report the good news. Alone again with Victoria, Max felt the weight of revelations and accusations between them. She seemed about to speak when William's voice called from the dining room. "Victoria, is everything all right?" "In there, fine," she called back, her eyes never leaving Max's face. "We're just preparing dessert." She lowered her voice again. "This conversation isn't finished. There's more you should know." Max turned away, focusing on retrieving ingredients for the improvised dessert. "Nothing more to say. Past is past." "Is it?" Victoria challenged quietly. Because it seems to me you've been living in that past for 5 years, letting it define your present. The observation cut too close to the truth for comfort. Max busied himself with opening cans of peaches, aware that Victoria remained watching. Him, waiting for a response he wasn't prepared to give. "Go on," he said finally. "Your family's waiting. I'll bring dessert out when it's ready." Victoria hesitated, then nodded once before returning to the dining area. Through the pass-through window, Max watched as she rejoined the group gathered around the game board, William placing a casual arm around her shoulders as she sat beside him. The simple gesture of affection between them struck Max unexpectedly. In his mind, William Harrington had been a faceless corporate entity, not a flesh-and-blood man with a family he clearly loved. The realization didn't diminish the injury done to Max's restaurant and career, but it complicated his carefully maintained narrative of villains and victims. As he prepared the simple dessert, listening to the laughter and good-natured competition, from the dining area, Max confronted an uncomfortable truth. He'd been defining himself by what he'd lost for so long that he'd forgotten who he was beyond that loss. The power flickered briefly, a reminder of their precarious situation. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling, the silence that followed a major storm settling over Pine Haven. Tomorrow would likely bring plows and road clearings, ending this strange interlude of forced proximity. What then? Would he simply return to his carefully constructed anonymity, flipping eggs and making club sandwiches as if the Harringtons had never blown into his life on the winds of a blizzard? Or had something fundamental shifted during these snowbound hours, something that couldn't be undone even after the roads were clear? Max arranged the desserts on small plates, the presentation more careful than was strictly necessary for diner service. Some habits, it seemed, never quite disappeared, no matter how deeply buried. In the dining area, Emma was theatrically bemoaning her bankruptcy, while Lucas gleefully collected her property cards. Natalie documented the scene with obvious enjoyment, while William and Victoria exchanged fond glances at their children's antics. They looked up as Max approached with the dessert tray. A normal family, enjoying a simple pleasure in extraordinary circumstances. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different path where his restaurant had thrived, where he might have had a family of his own, where bitterness hadn't become his most faithful companion. "That looks amazing," Natalie exclaimed as he set the plates down. "You really are full of surprises, Max." "Just canned peaches," he replied automatically, but without the usual edge to his dismissal. Lucas took a bite and closed his eyes and exaggerated. "A bliss. This is the best dessert I've ever had." "Lucas," Emma scoffed, "you said that about the gas station donuts last month." "That was before I tasted this," the boy replied with impeccable logic. William sampled the dessert, his expression thoughtful. "Simple ingredients elevated through technique and care," he observed, looking directly at Max. "The hallmark of truly exceptional cooking." The compliment, delivered with evident sincerity, caused a complicated surge of emotion in Max. Pride in his craft warred with resentment toward the man offering praise, while an unfamiliar longing for connection threatened the careful isolation he'd maintained for years. "Board games waiting," Max said, gesturing to the Monopoly set with its hotels and colorful money. "Don't let good property go unimproved." William held his gaze for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them, an acknowledgement perhaps that more remained to be said when circumstances allowed. As Max returned to the kitchen, he felt the weight of Victoria's earlier words. Had he been living in the past, allowing a single devastating loss to define his entire existence? The question followed him like a shadow as he finished cleaning up, as persistent and unavoidable as the storm that had brought the Harringtons into his life. Outside, the clouds began to break, revealing a star-studded sky of crystalline clarity. The storm had passed, but Max suspected the true reckoning was yet to come. Morning arrived with blinding brilliance, sunlight reflecting off the pristine snow, creating a dazzling white landscape. The storm had finally exhausted itself overnight, leaving Pine Haven buried but beginning to stir under clear blue skies. The distant rumble of snowplows could be heard from the main highway, slowly working their way toward the isolated town. Max had risen before dawn, his mind too cluttered with the previous day's revelations to allow for restful sleep. He stood at the diner's front window, coffee in hand, watching as Pine Haven gradually awakened from its weather-induced hibernation. Hank Morgan's ancient plow-fitted truck lumbered down the main street, carving a narrow path through drifts that reached past his headlights. Lights flickered on in homes as power was gradually restored to the grid, section by section. The world was returning to normal. The question that had kept Max awake was whether he could or should do the same. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Natalie's voice startled him from his thoughts. The filmmaker joined him at the window, her camera in hand. The pristine aftermath, everything familiar made new again by the snow. Max grunted non-committally, though he couldn't disagree. There was something transformative about the landscape, as though the storm had wiped the town clean and offered it a fresh beginning. "Mind if I film some of this?" Natalie asked, already adjusting her camera settings. "The quality of light now is incredible." "Free country," Max replied with a shrug. Natalie raised her camera, capturing the glittering expanse outside. "You know, when I started this documentary, I was focused on how small towns resist corporate influence," she said conversationally, as though continuing a thought rather than starting a new one. "But the story that keeps emerging is about identity, how people and communities define themselves in relation to outside forces." Max studied her with newfound wariness. Had Victoria shared his identity with the filmmaker? Was this Natalie's subtle way of addressing what she'd learned? "Some things define you whether you want them to or not," he said carefully. Natalie lowered her camera, her expression thoughtful. "True. But the question is whether you accept that definition or create your own." She gestured toward the transformed. "A landscape. Like this storm, it changed everything on the surface, but underneath Pine Haven is still Pine Haven. Different, maybe. Adapting, certainly, but fundamentally itself." Before Max could respond to the thinly veiled metaphor, movement on the stairs announced the arrival of the Harringtons. William descended first, followed by Victoria and the children. They dressed in yesterday's clothes, now somewhat rumpled from their unexpected extended stay. "The plows are out," William observed, joining them at the window. "Any word on when they'll reach the pass?" "Sheriff Taylor called on the landline about 20 minutes ago," Max replied, maintaining a careful distance. "Said they should have. The main road passable by noon. Your car might need to be dug out, but you should be able to get through to Aspen by late afternoon." Relief and something like regret flickered across William's features. "That's good news. We've imposed on your hospitality long enough." An awkward silence fell over the group, the imminent end of their forced proximity creating a strange tension. For 48 hours, they had existed in a bubble outside normal life, strangers thrown together by circumstance, connecting in ways that might never have occurred under ordinary conditions. Now, with the roads clearing, the real world waited. "To reclaim them, I should make breakfast," Max said, retreating to the familiar sanctuary of the kitchen. "Use up perishables before the power stabilizes." "I'll help," Victoria offered, following him before he could object. In the kitchen, they moved through their now established rhythm, working together with the wordless communication of experienced cooks. Max cracked eggs while Victoria sliced the last of the fresh bread for toast, neither acknowledging the conversation left unfinished the night before. "William doesn't know," Victoria said finally, keeping her voice low. About your restaurant. About the connection. Max paused mid-crack, the egg delicately balanced between his fingers. Why tell me that? Because you deserve to know that he wasn't personally involved in what happened to Sullivan's. She measured coffee into the filter with precise movements. The Chicago region was Bradley Parker's territory. He was the one who pushed for aggressive acquisitions during that period. The name hit Max like an electric shock. Bradley Parker, the smooth-talking executive who had first approached him about a strategic partnership, whose promises had gradually morphed into control until Max found himself an employee in his own restaurant. Then finally, not even that. Parker, reported directly to your husband, Max countered, recovering his composure. The approval had to come from the top. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. Harrington Restaurant Group has a complex corporate structure. Regional directors had considerable autonomy during that period. Too much, as it turned out. Several acquisitions from that time eventually proved problematic. Problematic, Max repeated, the euphemism stoking his long-simmering anger. Is that what you call dismantling someone's life's work? A problem to be managed? That's not what I meant, Victoria replied, frustration edging her voice. William began investigating Parker's methods after several chefs filed complaints about broken promises and altered agreements. Your restaurant wasn't the only one affected by Parker's tactics. Max turned away, focusing on whisking eggs with more force than necessary. Why are you telling me this now? What possible difference could it make after 5 years? Victoria was silent for a long moment, arranging bread on a baking sheet with careful precision. Because last night at dinner when you served that stew, I saw something in William's face I haven't seen in years. Recognition of what made him fall in love with restaurants in the first place. She looked up, meeting Max's gaze directly. And because you're too talented to spend the rest of your life hiding in a mountain diner, letting bitterness define your future. The frank assessment left Max momentarily speechless. Before he could formulate a response, Lucas bounded into the kitchen, his perpetual energy seemingly undiminished by days of confinement. Mom, Emma says we're leaving today, is that true? I don't want to go yet. Victoria smoothed her son's tousled hair. The roads will be clear soon, sweetheart. We need to get to Aspen. Lucas's face fell. But I haven't learned all of Mr. Sullivan's cooking secrets yet, and we didn't finish our Monopoly game. I'm pretty sure your dad was about to bankrupt us all anyway. Victoria consoled him with a smile. And as for cooking secrets, well, maybe Mr. Sullivan would consider sharing a recipe or two for you to practice at home. Both turned expectantly to Max, who found himself unexpectedly moved by the boy's genuine disappointment. Lucas had attached himself to Max with the innocent enthusiasm only children could muster, seeing past the gruff exterior to something Max himself had nearly forgotten existed. Got a notebook? Max asked, surprising himself as much as them. I'll write down the hot chocolate recipe, the secret one. Lucas's face illuminated with delight. Really? With the cinnamon and cayenne and everything, I'll get my backpack. He dashed from the kitchen, leaving Max and Victoria in a moment of shared amusement that transcended their complicated history. He's going to make that hot chocolate for everyone. He knows, Victoria said fondly. You've made quite an impression on him. Max returned to breakfast preparation, uncomfortable with the observation, but unable to deny the warmth it kindled. Kid's got good instincts about food, rare at his age. He gets that from me, Victoria said with a hint of pride. William can taste the difference between excellent and exceptional, but Lucas actually understands the why of it. She paused, adding more quietly, I'd hoped he might pursue culinary training someday, but William has other ideas. Grooming him for the family business? Max asked, unable to keep a edge from his voice. William believes Lucas should have the same opportunities he had, Victoria replied diplomatically. I believe Lucas should discover his own path. The conversation dissolved as the others filtered into the kitchen, drawn by the aroma of brewing, coffee, and cooking breakfast. Natalie had ventured outside briefly, her cheeks flushed with cold as she showed Emma footage she'd captured of the transformed town. William studied his phone with evident relief. "Signal's back," he announced. "Weak but functional. I've got about 50 emails from the office." "Can't they survive 2 days without you?" Emma asked with teenage bluntness. William looked up, momentarily, startled by the question. "Of course they can, that's not the point. What is the point?" Emma pressed, a challenge in her voice that suggested this wasn't a new conversation between them. "We're supposed to be on vacation." "Emma," Victoria cautioned quietly. "No, she's right," William said, surprising them all as he set his phone down. "The emails can wait until we reach Aspen. Right now, I'm more interested in whatever is causing that amazing smell." Max served breakfast, a hearty frittata incorporating the last of their fresh ingredients, crisp toast with homemade preserves, and slices of apple sprinkled with cinnamon. Despite its simplicity, the meal showcased his talent for balancing flavors and textures, elevating ordinary ingredients through technique and intuition. They ate together at the counter, the formality of the previous evening's dinner arrangement abandoned in favor of casual camaraderie. Lucas proudly showed Max the notebook where he intended to record the promised recipe, while Emma and Natalie discussed the possibility of including footage from the blizzard in her documentary. "So what happens to this place while Ruth's away?" William asked, gesturing around the diner with his fork. Max shrugged. "Stays closed until the roads are completely clear. Ruth won't risk the drive from her sister's place until the county gives the all clear." "Seems like a shame," William observed, "especially with so many people in town who might need a hot meal after the storm." "Power's just coming back on," Max pointed out. "Most people prepared with non-perishables." "Still," William pressed, "there's something reassuring about community gathering spots after a crisis, places that signal a return to normalcy." Max narrowed his eyes slightly, sensing something beneath the casual observation. "Ruth makes those decisions. It's her diner." "Of course," William agreed easily. "Just thinking aloud." The conversation shifted to their departure plans, with William calling the Aspen Lodge to confirm their reservation remained active despite their delayed arrival. Max listened with half an attention, his mind occupied with Victoria's earlier revelations about Bradley Parker and what they might mean for his carefully maintained narrative of victimhood. After breakfast, the Harringtons gathered their belongings, while Max and Natalie worked to restore the diner to its normal state. Sheriff Taylor arrived mid-morning, his cruiser creating deep tracks in the still substantial snow. "Main road's passable now," he announced, stomping snow from his boots at the entrance. "Single lane in some spots, but the plows got through. Thought you folks might need a lift to your vehicle." William extended his hand to the sheriff. "That's extremely kind of you. We can't thank this town enough for the assistance during the storm." Sheriff Taylor waved off the gratitude. "Pine Haven takes care of its own and its visitors, just the mountain way." He nodded toward Max. "Sullivan been treating you all right? He's not known for his hospitality skills." "Mr. Sullivan has been extraordinary," Victoria interjected before her husband could respond. "We wouldn't have survived without him, quite literally in Lucas's case." The sheriff's eyebrows rose appreciatively. "Well, that's something. Max here usually prefers the company of his cookbooks to actual people." Max ignored the good-natured ribbing, busying himself with final preparations for their departure. He'd packed a bag with sandwiches and thermoses of soup for their journey, a professional habit of ensuring no one left his establishment hungry. As the Harringtons prepared to depart with Sheriff Taylor, the moment Max had both dreaded and anticipated arrived, the necessary goodbye, the return to separate lives that now felt strangely intertwined. Lucas approached first, clutching his notebook with the carefully transcribed hot chocolate recipe. "Thank you for teaching me stuff," he said solemnly. "I'm going to practice until I get it perfect." Max knelt to the boy's level, finding himself unexpectedly moved. "You've got good hands and better instincts. Trust them both." Emma offered a teenager's awkward wave, her earlier disdain replaced by reluctant respect. "Thanks for the coffee, and for not treating us like we were helpless just because we got stuck here." Victoria embraced him briefly, the unexpected physical contact catching Max off guard. "This isn't the end of the conversation," she whispered. "Just a pause." Finally, William stood before him, hand extended. Max hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake, the simple contact bridging a divide he'd once thought uncrossable. "I owe you a debt that can't be repaid with mere thanks," William said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "You saved my son's life and sheltered my family when we needed it most." "Anyone would have done the same," Max replied automatically. William shook his head. "We both know that's not true. I won't forget this, Mr. Sullivan." Something in his tone, a hint of the businessman beneath the grateful father, caused Max to study him more closely. "Just glad the boy's okay." As Sheriff Taylor escorted the family to his cruiser, Lucas turned back for one final wave. Max found himself returning the gesture before catching himself, uncomfortable with the sentiment it revealed. Natalie remained behind, gathering her equipment with unhurried movements. "That was quite a storm in more ways than one," she observed. "I've been documenting small towns for over a year, and I've never seen anything quite like what happened here." Max began wiping down the counter with methodical strokes. "Just people, waiting out bad weather, nothing special about it, no?" Natalie raised an eyebrow. "A renowned chef who disappeared from the culinary world shelters the very family whose company was responsible for his downfall. That's not just a coincidence, Max. That's a story." He froze mid-motion, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature spreading through him. "Victoria told you." She didn't have to. Natalie's expression softened. "I recognize your work. I did a piece on Chicago's restaurant scene about 5 years ago, right around the time Sullivan's closed. Your cooking is distinctive. I suspected who you were that first night, but it wasn't my place to say anything." Max resumed wiping, his movements more aggressive. "There's no story here, nothing worth documenting." "I disagree," Natalie countered gently. "What I witnessed over the past 2 days was reconciliation in microcosm, the human face of corporate expansion meeting the human cost of it. That's exactly what my documentary explores." "I'm not interested in being part of your film," Max said. Flatly, Natalie studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I respect that, but consider this. Stories have power. They can maintain the status quo, or they can catalyze change." She hefted her camera bag onto her shoulder. "The Harringtons saw you as a person these past 2 days, not just collateral damage in a business transaction. That matters, Max." Left alone in the diner as Natalie departed for the inn, Max found himself in unsettling silence. For the first time in 5 years, the solitude he'd cultivated felt less like protection and more like confinement. The Harringtons had blown into his life on the wings of a blizzard, disrupting more than just his daily routine. They'd unsettled the very foundations of the identity he'd constructed since leaving Chicago. Outside, Pine Haven gradually returned to life. Neighbors helped neighbors dig out driveways. Children constructed elaborate snow forts from the abundant raw material. The community Max had joined but never fully entered continued its resilient adaptation to mountain life and its challenges. He moved to the window, watching as Sheriff Taylor's cruiser disappeared around the corner, carrying the Harringtons back to their interrupted vacation and eventually to their privileged life in Chicago. The encounter that had seemed so monumental inside the confines of the storm-besieged diner already felt like it was fading into anecdote. An unusual experience to be recounted at future dinner parties, perhaps, but nothing truly transformative. And yet Max found himself recalling the care with which Lucas had transcribed his hot chocolate recipe, the genuine appreciation in Victoria's assessment of his cooking, William's parting words with their hint of something beyond mere gratitude. Small moments that had cracked the protective shell he'd built around himself, allowing glimpses of a different future than the one he'd resigned himself to. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Ruth's voice came through with customary directness. "Max, Sheriff Taylor says the worst is over. How's my diner?" "Fine," he assured her. "Generator kept everything running. No pipes burst." "And those people who got stranded there?" He mentioned a family with a sick kid. "Gone now. Sheriff gave them a lift to their car about 20 minutes ago." Ruth's relieved sigh was audible, even through the poor connection. "Good. Listen, the roads to my sister's place won't be clear until tomorrow at least. Think you can handle opening?" "For limited service later today. Town's been shut down for 2 days. Folks will be looking for a hot meal and company." Max hesitated, the prospect of returning to normal diner operations suddenly feeling like donning clothes he'd outgrown. For 2 days, he'd cooked with purpose again, creating food that reflected his true capabilities rather than merely filling stomachs. "Max, you still there?" "Yeah," he replied, making a decision that surprised him even as the words left his mouth. "Actually, Ruth, I was thinking of trying something different today, a special menu. Comfort food, but elevated a bit, given the circumstances." The silence on the other end lasted so long that Max wondered if the connection had failed. "You want to cook real food?" Ruth finally asked, disbelief evident in her voice. "Not just the standard diner fare?" "Just today," Max clarified quickly. "People have been through a lot with the storm, might appreciate something special." Another pause, shorter this time. "Well, I'll be damned. 3 years you've been flipping burgers and slinging hash like it was beneath you, and suddenly you want to flex those fancy chef muscles?" Her tone softened. "About time, if you ask me. Do whatever you want with the menu today. Just don't scare off my regulars with anything too bizarre." After hanging up, Max stood in the center of the diner, possibility expanding around him like the clearing skies outside. One special menu wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't rebuild what had been taken from him. But perhaps, like the snow transforming Pine Haven's familiar landscape, it could reveal new contours in a life he'd thought permanently defined by loss. He moved to the kitchen, mentally inventorying available ingredients and considering what he could create that would be both approachable for Ruth's regular customers and satisfying to his long-neglected standards. For the first time in 5 years, Maxwell Sullivan allowed himself to think like a chef again, if only for one day. Outside, the sun continued its work, beginning the slow transformation of Pine Haven from isolated winter outpost back to bustling mountain community. Change was coming, to the landscape, to the town, and perhaps even to the solitary cook who had found unexpected connection amidst the storm's fury. The news spread through Pine Haven with the efficiency that only small towns can manage. Max Sullivan was cooking a special post-blizzard menu at the diner. By noon, a line had formed outside the entrance, residents eager to emerge from their snowbound homes and reconnect with neighbors over a meal that promised to be unlike Ruth's standard fare. Max moved through the kitchen with a focus he hadn't permitted himself in years. He'd inventoried the pantry and freezer, discovering resources Ruth had stocked, but he had never fully utilized. Local game that Hank Morgan had contributed after successful hunting trips, preserves and pickles from Martha Wilson's garden, root vegetables that had weathered the power outage in the cool storeroom. With these humble ingredients, Max began composing dishes that honored their origins while elevating them through technique and imagination. A venison stew simmered on the back burner, enriched with juniper berries and a splash of bourbon from the bottle Ruth kept for special occasions. Fresh bread rose on the warming shelf, the yeast working steadily in the kitchen's heat. Max had even discovered a cache of local cheeses in the refrigerator's bottom drawer, neglected in favor of the pre-sliced American that topped the diner's burgers. Natalie arrived as Max was laying out plates for service, her camera slung over her shoulder. "Mind if I document this?" she asked, gesturing toward the unusual preparations. The town coming together after the storm, sharing a meal that celebrates local resilience. It's perfect for my project. Max hesitated, his instinct for privacy warring with the recognition that today wasn't about him alone. "Just the dining room," he said finally. "Kitchen's off limits." Natalie nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. "I heard people talking about your special menu at the inn. Word travels fast around here." "Small towns," Max acknowledged with a shrug. Though privately he'd been surprised by the enthusiastic response. He'd expected perhaps a handful of curious diners, not the steady stream of Pine Haven residents now filling the booths and counter seats. "This isn't just about feeding people after a storm, is it?" Natalie observed, her filmmaker's instinct for narrative evident. "It's about reclaiming something." Max turned away from her perceptiveness, uncomfortable with having his motivations so easily read. "It's about using up perishables before they spoil," he muttered, though they both knew it was far more than that. He opened the diner precisely at noon, moving among the tables with a confidence he hadn't displayed in his 3 years at Ruth's establishment. Instead of reciting the day's specials with disinterest, he described each dish with precision and quiet pride, explaining the origins of key ingredients and the techniques that transformed them. Sheriff Taylor occupied his usual stool at the counter, eyebrows rising in appreciation as Max set a bowl of venison stew before him. "This isn't your usual kitchen work, Sullivan," he observed after the first spoonful. "Been holding out on us?" Max adjusted the placement of the accompanying bread with unnecessary precision. "Just felt like doing something different after the storm." "Well, different suits you," the sheriff replied, breaking off a piece of bread to soak up the rich broth. "Seems like those Harringtons left quite an impression." Max tensed slightly at the mention of the family. "How'd they get on?" "Made it to Aspen all right, far as I know. Got them to their car, which started up fine once we dug it out. Mr. Harrington was mighty generous with his thanks, tried to give me a $100 bill for the ride." "Let me guess," Max said wryly. "You refused?" Sheriff Taylor grinned. "Told him we don't take payment for helping folks in need around here, though I did suggest a donation to the volunteer fire department if he was feeling charitable." His expression grew more serious. "That boy of theirs asked about you all the way to their car. Seemed pretty attached after just a couple days." Max busied himself wiping down an already clean section of counter, unwilling to acknowledge the twinge of emotion the sheriff's observation provoked. Lucas's earnest interest in cooking, his wide-eyed appreciation of Max's skill, these had penetrated defenses Max had thought impervious. The diner filled to capacity as afternoon progressed, familiar faces mingling with those Max recognized but had never truly engaged with during his time in Pine Haven. Hank Morgan arrived with his wife Alice, claiming a corner booth and nodding appreciatively at the venison stew. "Using that buck I brought in last November," the mechanic observed with satisfaction. "Knew you'd do something proper with it eventually." Mayor Jenkins made an appearance, making a show of sampling each special and pronouncing them worthy of establishments in Denver or beyond. Natalie moved through the space with her camera, capturing the community's reunion after the isolating storm, occasionally casting thoughtful glances toward Max that he deliberately avoided acknowledging. As the lunch rush began to wane, Max emerged from the kitchen to check on his customers, a chef's habit he'd abandoned years ago along with his professional identity. The dining room hummed with conversation and appreciation, creating an atmosphere entirely different from the diner's usual functional efficiency. "You've transformed this place," Natalie observed, joining him near the coffee station. "Not just the food, the entire feeling." Max shrugged, uncomfortable with her assessment despite recognizing its accuracy. "It's one day. Things go back to normal when Ruth returns tomorrow." Natalie studied him with the penetrating gaze he'd come to recognize as her documentary filmmaker's perspective. "Does normal still fit you, Max? After what happened during the storm?" The question hit with unexpected force, articulating the disquiet that had been building since the Harringtons' departure. Did normal, his self-imposed exile, his deliberate diminishment of his talents, his carefully maintained bitterness, still fit? Or had it become a constraint rather than a protection? Before he could formulate a response, the bell above the diner door chimed. Max turned, expecting another local resident seeking connection and sustenance after the storm. Instead, William Harrington stood in the entrance, snowmelt dampening his expensive boots as he surveyed the crowded diner with evident surprise. Max froze, coffee pot suspended mid-pour. The dining room's ambient conversation dipped momentarily as Pine Haven's residents assessed the newcomer, clearly an outsider, clearly wealthy, clearly unexpected. William spotted Max and moved purposefully toward him, navigating between tables, with the confidence of a man accustomed to entering unfamiliar territories. "Mr. Sullivan," he greeted, his voice carrying the precise blend of authority and cordiality that had likely served him well in corporate boardrooms. "I was hoping to catch you before we left the area." Max set down the coffee pot with careful control, aware of the curious gazes now directed their way. "Thought you'd be halfway to Aspen by now." "Change of plans," William replied, gesturing toward an empty booth in the corner. "Do you have a moment? I'd like to discuss something with you." Every instinct urged Max to refuse, to retreat behind the counter and maintain the distance between his present life and the man who represented his lost past. But curiosity, and something else he wasn't ready to name, propelled him toward the booth. "Make it quick," he said, sliding into the seat opposite William. "We're busy today." William glanced around at the crowded diner, taking in the empty plates and satisfied expressions. "So I see. Sheriff Taylor mentioned you were doing something special for the town after the storm." He inhaled appreciatively. "It smells extraordinary in here." "What do you want, Mr. Harrington?" Max asked directly, unwilling to engage in pleasantries with the man whose company, if not the man himself, had dismantled his career. William's expression sobered. "First, to thank you again for what you did for my family, particularly for Lucas. His asthma attacks can be frightening. Your knowledge and quick thinking made a critical difference." Max nodded once, acknowledging the gratitude without accepting it fully. "And second, William continued, meeting Max's gaze directly, "I'd like to offer you a proposition." "Not interested in selling the diner?" Max replied immediately. "It's not mine to sell, and Ruth wouldn't consider it anyway." William shook his head. "That's not why I'm here." He leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from polite businessman to something more genuine. "Victoria told me who you are, about Sullivan's in Chicago, about what happened." Cold spread through Max's chest, followed quickly by heat. "When?" "This morning on the drive toward Aspen." William's gaze remained steady. "She felt I should know, before making any decisions about our next steps." Next steps, Max repeated flatly. There are no next steps, Mr. Harrington. Your company destroyed my restaurant 5 years ago. I've built a new life. End of story. William was silent for a moment, his expression contemplative. Is it? Because what I witnessed over the past 2 days was a chef of extraordinary talent working as a short-order cook. What I'm seeing right now, he gestured toward the dining room filled with satisfied customers, suggests that arrangement may no longer be satisfying for you. The accurate assessment provoked a flare of defensive anger. You don't know anything about me or what satisfies me. True, William conceded with unexpected humility, but I know talent when I see it. I know passion, even when it's being deliberately suppressed. And I know that what happened to Sullivan's was wrong. Max stared at him, caught off guard by the direct acknowledgement. Victoria said you weren't personally involved. I wasn't, William confirmed, but I was CEO. The corporate culture that allowed Bradley Parker to employ those tactics existed. Under my leadership, that responsibility is ultimately mine. The frank admission disarmed Max's prepared defenses. For 5 years, he'd maintained a simplistic narrative of corporate villainy, with William Harrington as its faceless embodiment. The man sitting before him, taking ownership of his company's failures while seeking some form of resolution, complicated that narrative beyond recognition. What exactly do you want from me? Max asked finally. William took a deep breath. I want to offer you the opportunity to rebuild. Not Sullivan's exactly. That moment has passed. But something new, something that honors your vision while expanding it. He paused, gauging Max's reaction. We've been developing a new initiative called Heritage Kitchens, small-scale chef-driven restaurants focusing on regional American cuisine, each with complete creative independence. Max's professional interest stirred despite his reservations. Sounds like a departure from your usual model. It is, William acknowledged. The company has drifted from my father's original vision. We started with one diner serving honest food made with care and somehow ended up with 1,000 increasingly homogenized restaurants. Something like regret crossed his features. Victoria's been saying for years that we've lost our way. Watching you cook for my family during the storm, I realized she was right. The conversation had veered into territory Max hadn't anticipated. William Harrington expressing doubt about his corporate empire, acknowledging missteps, proposing a return to culinary fundamentals. Why me? Max challenged. There are hundreds of talented chefs who don't have reason to despise your company. William smiled slightly. Because you feed people like it matters. Because your approach to ingredients, honoring their origins, transforming them through technique rather than disguising them, aligns perfectly with what Heritage Kitchens aims to achieve. He glanced around the diner. And because my son hasn't stopped talking about your cooking since we left this morning. Despite himself, Max felt a flicker of pleasure at the mention of Lucas. The boy has good taste. He does, William agreed. He also has an uncanny ability to recognize authenticity, something I may have lost sight of along the way. A silence fell between them, filled with the ambient sounds of the diner. Conversations, silverware against plates, the hiss of the espresso machine that Max had coaxed back to life that morning. In that quiet moment, Max confronted the truth he'd been avoiding since the Harringtons had entered his life. His bitterness, however justified initially, had become a prison of his own making. I'm not interested in joining your corporate structure, he said finally. Been there, didn't end well. William nodded, accepting the boundary. Heritage Kitchens isn't a traditional corporate arrangement. Each restaurant operates independently with its chef as partial owner. Harrington provides initial capital, infrastructure support, and marketing, but creative control remains entirely with the chef. Sounds too good to be true, Max observed skeptically. It's good business, William countered. The dining public is increasingly sophisticated, seeking authentic experiences rather than predictable uniformity. Heritage Kitchens is an investment in that future. Max rubbed the back of his neck, the tension of conflicting impulses manifesting physically. The proposition appealed to the chef in him, the part he'd suppressed but never truly extinguished. Yet the wariness born from previous betrayal couldn't be easily dismissed. I'd need to see documentation, talk to lawyers, understand exactly what I'd be committing to. Of course, William agreed readily. I wouldn't expect anything less. All I'm asking for today is your willingness to consider the possibility. Before Max could respond, Natalie appeared at their table, her filmmaker's instinct for dramatic moments apparently intact. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, though her expression suggested the opposite. "Max, people are asking if there's going to be dinner service as well. Word about the venison stew has apparently reached the next town over." Max glanced toward the kitchen, mentally calculating remaining ingredients and potential menu adaptations. The prospect of continuing this unexpected culinary expression, of cooking food that reflected his true capabilities rather than merely meeting basic expectations, was undeniably appealing. "Tell them yes," he decided, rising from the booth. "Limited menu, first come, first served." Natalie smiled knowingly before departing to spread the word. Max turned back to William, who watched him with evident interest. "You enjoy this," William observed, "creating food that connects with people. It's not just technique for you, it's communication." The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. "Need to prep if we're doing dinner service," Max said, avoiding a direct response. "Whatever you're proposing, leave the information. I'll look it over." William reached into his jacket pocket, producing a slim folder. "Contact details, preliminary Heritage Kitchens concept overview, and the structure of chef partnerships." He placed it on the table between them. "Take your time. This isn't a snap decision." As Max reached for the folder, William added, "One more thing. Lucas asked me to give you this." He withdrew a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Max. Opening it revealed a child's drawing, unmistakably the diner, rendered in crayon, with a tall figure in a white coat standing proudly in the center. Beneath the image in careful print, "Thank you for teaching me about food, from Lucas." Max stared at the drawing, unexpectedly moved by the simple expression of gratitude and connection. The boy had seen him, not just the diner cook, not just the man who'd sheltered his family during a storm, but the chef he had once been and perhaps could be again. "He's got talent," Max said gruffly, carefully refolding the drawing. William smiled. "He does. For more than just drawing." He stood, extending his hand across the table. "Thank you again, Mr. Sullivan, for everything." This time, Max accepted. The handshake without reservation, the simple human contact, bridging divides of experience and expectation. As William departed, navigating through the still crowded diner with a parting wave, Max remained at the booth, the folder and Lucas's drawing before him like artifacts from alternate futures. Natalie reappeared, her expression suggesting she'd witnessed the entire exchange. "That looked intense," she observed, sliding into the booth opposite Max. "Care to share what that was about?" Max gathered the folder and drawing, tucking them carefully into his apron pocket. "Not particularly." "Fair enough." Natalie gestured toward the kitchen. "But whatever it was seems to have lit a fire under you. I haven't seen you move with such purpose since you rescued me from the snow." Max followed her gaze toward the bustling diner, seeing it suddenly through fresh eyes, not as the place of exile he'd considered it for 3 years, but as a space of possibility. The customers weren't just anonymous stomachs to fill, but individuals, seeking nourishment in all its forms after days of isolation. "Got dinner to prepare," he said, rising from the booth. "If you're going to film, stay out of the kitchen," Natalie smiled knowingly. "Wouldn't dream of interfering with an artist at work." Max would have bristled at the description days earlier, rejecting the identity he'd abandoned along with his restaurant. Now he merely nodded, his mind already turning toward the evening's menu, the ingredients available, the techniques that would honor them, the people who would gather around tables to share the results. The storm had passed, but its transformative effects continued to reshape landscapes both external and internal. As Max returned to the kitchen, he carried with him not just William's proposition and Lucas's drawing, but the first fragile seedlings of something he'd thought permanently frozen: hope. 3 months after the blizzard that had buried Pine Haven, beneath 3 feet of snow, spring arrived in the mountains with characteristic vigor. Meadows exploded with wildflowers, aspen trees unfurled tender green leaves, and the creek that ran behind the diner swelled with snowmelt, racing down from higher elevations. Change had come to more than just the landscape. The Pine Haven diner stood transformed, both physically and in purpose. The worn linoleum floor had been replaced with reclaimed pine planks. The chipped formica countertops now gleamed with polished soapstone. The kitchen, once adequate but uninspiring, had been expanded and equipped with professional-grade appliances that made even the most ambitious culinary undertakings possible. But the most significant transformation had occurred in the man who now moved confidently through this revitalized space. Max Sullivan, no longer just a diner cook but once again a chef, supervised final preparations for the evening service, his practiced eye missing nothing as he inspected each station. "Mark, the venison needs to rest longer before slicing," he instructed a young cook who joined the kitchen staff 2 weeks earlier. "Remember what we discussed about carryover cooking?" "Yes, chef," Mark responded, adjusting his approach with evident eagerness to learn. The formal address, chef rather than Max or Sullivan, still occasionally caught him off guard, a reminder of the identity he'd reclaimed after years of deliberate obscurity. The journey from embittered exile to his current role had not been straightforward or without doubts, but standing in this kitchen, overseeing a menu of his own creation, Max felt a sense of rightness that had eluded him for 5 years. Ruth pushed through the swinging door from the dining room, clipboard in hand. "Reservations are full again tonight," she announced, satisfaction evident in her voice. "3rd weekend in a row. Never thought I'd see the day when people needed to book a table 2 weeks in advance at my diner. Not just your diner anymore," Max reminded her, though without rancor. Their partnership, formalized after weeks of negotiation and careful consideration, had transformed Ruth's dependable but unremarkable establishment into Pine Haven's first destination restaurant, drawing diners from neighboring towns and even Denver on weekends. "Still getting used to that," Ruth admitted, "though I can't complain about the profit margins." After William Harrington's unexpected proposition that day following the blizzard, Max had spent weeks examining the Heritage Kitchen's concept from every angle, seeking potential pitfalls, hidden agendas, or any sign that history might repeat itself. He'd consulted lawyers, studied contracts, and even traveled to Chicago to meet with other chefs considering similar partnerships. What he'd discovered surprised him. William Harrington appeared to be genuinely committed to reinventing aspects of his company, returning to the principles of quality and authenticity that had launched his father's original diner decades earlier. The Heritage Kitchens initiative represented not just a business diversification, but something approaching a philosophical course correction. In the end, Max had proposed a variation on William's offer, rather than opening an entirely new restaurant. He suggested partnering with Ruth to transform the existing diner. The arrangement preserved what made Pine Haven special while elevating the culinary experience to reflect Max's capabilities. For Ruth, it meant less daily operational responsibility, but greater financial security. For Max, it offered a path forward that honored both his past excellence and his present community. The dining room began filling precisely at 5, a mix of locals and visitors creating a pleasant hum of anticipation. Unlike typical fine dining establishments, the reinvented diner maintained a relaxed atmosphere where flannel shirts mingled comfortably with cashmere sweaters, and conversations flowed as freely as the locally produced wines Max had added to. The menu. Sheriff Taylor claimed his usual stool at the counter, though he now used it to enjoy Max's elevated comfort food rather than just coffee and pie. "Evening, chef," he greeted with a grin that acknowledged the formality was partly in jest between old acquaintances. "What's the special tonight?" Max pointed toward the chalkboard where the day's offerings were written in Sophie Wilson's artistic script. "Braised bison short ribs with foraged mushrooms and stone-ground grits. Hank brought the bison in yesterday." "Fancy way of saying meat and mush," the sheriff observed good-naturedly, "but I'll take it anyway." The kitchen rhythm accelerated as orders began arriving, Max conducting his small team with the practiced efficiency of someone who had finally returned to his element. Each plate that left the pass reflected the philosophy that had once made Sullivan's in Chicago a critical darling: respect for ingredients, technical precision, and an understanding that food at its best tells a story about place and people. Midway through service, Natalie Brooks entered the diner, camera in hand as usual. She'd extended her stay in Pine Haven well beyond her original timeline, her documentary having evolved to include the diner's transformation as a central narrative thread. Max had initially resisted being featured, but eventually recognized that the story wasn't just about him. It encompassed the entire community and how they'd weathered both literal and metaphorical storms together. "Evening, Max," she greeted, setting up her equipment in the corner they'd designated for filming. "Mind if I get some kitchen footage tonight? The lighting's perfect with the sunset coming through those new windows." Max nodded his permission, no longer uncomfortable with her documentation. "Just stay clear of the line during rush." "Always do," she assured him. "Oh, and you should know, the Harringtons just pulled into the parking lot." Max's hands paused briefly over the plate he was finishing. The Harrington family had visited twice since the blizzard, once for the diner's grand reopening, and again when they'd passed through Pine Haven on their way to their Aspen property last month. Each visit had further cemented the unlikely connection between Max and the family, whose company had once represented everything he resented. "Lucas has been counting down the days," Natalie added with a knowing smile. "Apparently his mother's been letting him practice in their kitchen at home, and he's eager to show you what he's learned." Despite himself, Max felt a surge of anticipation. The boy's enthusiastic interest in cooking had become something of a bright spot in his life. Lucas sent drawings of dishes he'd attempted, and Victoria occasionally emailed photos of his culinary efforts, each showing promising improvement in technique and presentation. "Does Ruth know they're coming?" Max asked, returning his attention to the delicate plating before him. "She's already set aside their usual booth," Natalie confirmed. "And Mark wants to know if Lucas can tour the kitchen again after the main dinner rush." The door chimed and the Harrington family entered. William in a casual sport coat rather than his usual business attire, Victoria elegant in understated simplicity, Emma looking slightly less disaffected than during their snowbound days, and Lucas practically bouncing with excitement. They were greeted warmly by Ruth, who escorted them to the corner booth that offered both privacy and a view of the open kitchen where Max could be seen orchestrating the evening service. "Chef's compliments," Max instructed Sophie as he assembled a plate of appetizers, not on the regular menu, for the Harrington table. The simple act, an established tradition in high-end restaurants, but one he'd abandoned during his years of exile, felt like reclaiming another piece of his former identity, not with bitterness for what had been lost, but with appreciation for what remained possible. As the evening progressed, Max maintained his focus on service while keeping peripheral awareness of the Harringtons enjoying their meal. William occasionally caught his eye, offering appreciative nods at particularly successful dishes. Victoria's professional assessment was evident in her thoughtful consideration of each plate. Even Emma appeared genuinely impressed by the transformation of what she'd once dismissed as the middle of nowhere. During a brief lull between courses, Max emerged from the kitchen to check on several tables, intentionally making the Harringtons his final stop. "Everything satisfactory?" he asked, the professional formality softened by familiarity developed over their subsequent visits. "Beyond satisfactory," William replied warmly. "The bison is exceptional. The way you've balanced the richness with those pickled ramps adds a dimension I wasn't expecting." "Mom let me try pickling at home," Lucas interjected eagerly, "but mine didn't taste as good as yours." "Takes practice," Max told him, unable to suppress a small smile at the boy's enthusiasm. "Preserving is all about patience and precision." "That's what Mom says too," Lucas agreed. "Dad's terrible at it because he wants everything done right away." "Lucas," Victoria cautioned, though her expression conveyed amusement rather than true reproach. William laughed, showing the genuine warmth that had gradually replaced Max's mental image of the corporate raider. "He's not wrong. Patience has never been my strong suit, which is why I appreciate those who possess it." The conversation might have continued, but Max noticed Mark signaling from the kitchen. A new round of orders required his attention. "Duty calls," he said, already mentally shifting back to service mode. "Dessert menu will be around shortly. Lucas, if you want to see the kitchen later, have Sophie let me know." Returning to the controlled chaos of dinner service, Max found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. The blizzard that had forced the Harringtons into his life had begun a cascade of changes he could never have anticipated, from reclaiming his professional identity to forming unexpected connections that bridged his past and present. As the dining room gradually emptied and the kitchen completed its final orders, Max supervised cleanup with the thoroughness that had once made Sullivan's one of Chicago's most respected kitchens. Each surface gleamed, each implement returned to its proper place, each refrigerator organized with methodical precision. "Chef," Sophie called from the door, "the Harringtons are finishing up. Lucas is hoping for that kitchen tour before they leave." Max glanced around, ensuring everything was in order. "Send him back, just him for now." Lucas appeared moments later, his expression lighting with undisguised delight at being admitted to the professional kitchen. Unlike his first tour during the grand reopening, when everything had been carefully prepared for public viewing, tonight he was seeing a working kitchen in its post-service reality, still organized, but bearing the honest marks of a busy evening. "This is so cool," the boy breathed, taking in the professional equipment with appreciation beyond his years. "Way better than our kitchen at home." "Tools are just tools," Max told him, echoing his grandmother's wisdom. "It's what you do with them that matters." Lucas nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson. "Dad says that's why you're the most important. You're part of Heritage Kitchens, because you remember what really matters about cooking." The casual observation, delivered with a child's unfiltered honesty, caught Max off guard. "Your dad said that?" "Uh-huh. He tells the board people that they need to listen to the chefs more and the money people less." Lucas ran his fingers reverently along the edge of the prep counter. "He says you taught him that." Max absorbed this unexpected insight into William's corporate evolution, another piece of the complex puzzle their relationship had become. Not friends exactly, but no longer adversaries. something more nuanced that acknowledged their shared values despite their different paths. "Want to help with something?" Max asked, making a spontaneous decision. "Got a special project that could use an extra pair of hands." Lucas's eyes widened. "Really, like actually cooking?" "Really cooking," Max confirmed, retrieving ingredients from the refrigerator. "Your parents staying the night in Pine Haven?" Lucas nodded. "At the inn. We're going to Aspen tomorrow." "Good. Then we've got time to make something proper." Max handed Lucas an apron, helping him tie it properly. "Ever made ice cream from scratch?" The next hour passed in focused activity as Max guided Lucas through the process of creating a simple vanilla base. He adjusted his instructions to the boy's capabilities without diluting the professional standards, treating him not as a child to be humored, but as a serious student of culinary arts. "Now we chill this overnight," Max explained as they finished. "The base. Tomorrow morning before you leave, come by and we'll churn it, then add the compote we just made. Will it be as good as the dessert we had tonight?" Lucas asked, carefully scraping the last of the mixture into a container. "Different," Max replied. "That's the point of cooking, not to replicate exactly, but to understand the principles that make dishes work." He studied the boy's focused expression. "You really enjoy this, don't you?" Lucas nodded without hesitation. "Mom says I have the touch, like her grandmother. Dad wants me to learn business too, but..." He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "But cooking speaks to you differently," Max finished for him, recognizing the same pull that had drawn him from his grandmother's kitchen to culinary school decades earlier. "Yeah," Lucas agreed, relief evident in his voice. "Exactly like that." The kitchen door swung open as Victoria entered, her expression softening at the sight of her son standing beside Max at the prep counter, both focused on the task before them. "There you are," she said. "Dad's settling the bill. We should head to the inn soon." "Mom! Chef Sullivan is teaching me to make ice cream from scratch. Real ice cream, not from a machine or a mix. We have to come back tomorrow to finish it." Victoria met Max's gaze over her son's head, gratitude evident in her expression. "I think that can be arranged. We're not in a rush to reach Aspen." As Lucas excitedly explained the ice cream making process to his mother, Max began putting away the remaining ingredients, a familiar contentment settling over him. This kitchen, neither the high-end establishment he'd once commanded in Chicago, nor the simple diner where he'd hidden his talents, had become something he hadn't expected to find again, a place of purpose and connection. William appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with evident appreciation. "Looks like Lucas has found his happy place," he observed, joining Victoria. "Thank you for indulging him." "Not indulgence," Max corrected, the professional assessment coming naturally. "He has genuine aptitude, good instincts, careful technique. Rare at his age, pride and something more complex crossed William's features. Like his mother then, Victoria smiled, a private exchange passing between husband and wife. "We should get going. Lucas, say thank you to Chef Sullivan." Instead of the verbal thanks expected, Lucas surprised them all by stepping forward and wrapping his arms around Max's waist in a quick, fierce hug. "See you tomorrow for churning," he said with absolute certainty, before darting back to his parents. He sighed. The unexpected gesture left Max momentarily speechless, a tangle of emotion rising in his throat. He nodded once, not trusting his voice immediately. "We've been talking," William said after a moment, his tone shifting to something more deliberate, "about expanding the Heritage Kitchens concept. The board is impressed with how this location has performed, both financially and in terms of critical response." Max tensed slightly, old wariness resurfacing. "I'm not interested in managing multiple restaurants." "We know," Victoria assured him quickly. "That's not what William is suggesting." William nodded agreement. The next phase involves establishing a culinary education component, a program where promising young chefs could learn the philosophy that makes heritage kitchens distinctive. We'd like you to consider developing the curriculum and potentially teaching masterclasses. The proposal was unexpected, yet oddly aligned with the satisfaction Max had just experienced guiding Lucas through the ice cream preparation. Teaching had never been part of his professional ambitions, yet he found himself intrigued by the possibility of shaping the next generation of chefs. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "Send me the details." After the Harringtons departed, promising to return in the morning for Lucas's ice cream completion, Max completed his final kitchen checks and stepped outside into the clear mountain night. Stars stretched across the vast sky, unobscured by city lights or storm clouds, offering perspective that had been missing during his years of focused resentment. Natalie was packing up her equipment beside her car, preparing to leave after another evening of filming. She glanced up as Max approached. "Got some great footage tonight," she said, closing her camera bag. "Especially that moment with Lucas in the kitchen. Pure gold for the documentary." "When do you finish filming?" Max asked, realizing he'd grown accustomed to her presence documenting the diner's evolution. Another couple of weeks should do it, then months of editing. She smiled reflectively. "When I started this project, I thought I was documenting how small towns resist corporate influence. Instead, I found a story about how relationships can transform both individuals and institutions." Max considered her assessment, recognizing its accuracy. The blizzard had forced connections that would never have formed organically, between himself and the Harringtons, between Pine Haven's modest diner and a corporate restaurant empire, between a bitter past and a potentially redemptive future. "You were right, you know," he acknowledged quietly. "That day after the storm, when you said I'd been defining myself by what I'd lost." Natalie nodded, understanding the significance of his admission. "And now?" Max glanced back at the renovated diner, its warm lights promising nourishment, its kitchen containing possibility, its very existence representing his journey from isolation to renewed purpose. "Now I'm defining myself by what I'm building," he replied simply. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and possibility, reminiscent of that first morning after the blizzard, when the transformed landscape had hinted at new beginnings. Max breathed it in deeply, no longer fighting the currents of change, but allowing himself to move with them toward a future he was actively choosing rather than merely enduring. Tomorrow, Lucas would return to complete his ice cream. The heritage kitchen's proposal would require careful consideration. Ruth would tally the evening's impressive receipts. Pine Haven would continue embracing the establishment that had become its heart. And Max Sullivan, once celebrated chef, once embittered exile, now something altogether new, would continue the work of nourishing not just bodies, but the connections that sustained a community through all seasons. The storm had passed, leaving behind not devastation, but transformation. In its wake, Max had discovered that sometimes salvation arrives in unexpected forms, even as a family seeking shelter on a snowy night, unaware that their presence would thaw more than just the frozen landscape. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.